All right, so let's take a look at JAXB. So JAXB is a library, it's a Java library that allows us to very easily map XML documents into a Java model. It's kind of the equivalent of JPA. So JPA is a library that allows us to map relational databases, tables that are stored in a relational database, map them automatically into a Java data model. Yes. So JAXB plays the same role here, right? That allows us to map a Java data model, right, with an XML data model, right? So for instance, here we have a student.xml that has elements student and first name and last name, and we might want to map, right, that student XML document into a student Java class, right? So JAXB allows you to do that. Now, JAXB is it's a higher level library, very much like JPA was a higher level library, right? We saw that we also took a look at JDBC. JDBC was a low-level library that allows us to do all the CRUD operations with using plain old SQL language, right? And we created several DAOs and whatnot. And so the JDBC is a library. Is to the relational database what the DOM, Java DOM library is to XML library, right? XML documents, right? So the DOM library is very low level, allows you to manipulate and read and write XML document, but it's very, very low level. Just like JDBC is very, very low level when it's interacting with relational databases. Instead, we moved over to something a little more high level, like JPA, that allows us to do annotations that automatically map some XML document to some Java classes and attributes and properties, right? And setters and getters. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to use JAXB. JAXB stands for the Java Architecture for XML Binding, right? And all the implementation lives under the XML.bind Java package, right? And it allows us again to do an easily map XML documents to Java documents. And the way we are going to bind them is by using annotations, very, very similar like what we did JPA. In JPA, we use entity annotations such as @entity, @table, @id, generated value, blah, 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 right? So that allowed us to map all these fields in the relational database to fields in the Java class. So similar here. We can annotate the root element as @XML root element, and then each one of the Java fields, we can annotate them as either elements or attributes. So let's see an example. So here we have a Java class that represents a student. We'd like to map it maybe to this XML document down below. So first, a couple of standard things that we need to make sure. All the Java classes that we are working with, they all have to follow the Java Bean standard, right? And the standard, the convention, the set of conventions of the Java Bean is that all classes need to have the default constructor. And here we have, right? So the default constructor is required, especially, make sure that, if you are overloading the constructor, right, to make sure that you still have the default constructor available. Once you have that, also part of the Java Bean standard is that you have to have setters and getters, public setters and getters that allow you to mutate the state of your object. So certainly we have it here. And once you have that, once you can guarantee that your Java class is a Java Bean, you can then go ahead and map the class itself. You can map the class, map it to the root of the XML document. And the way you do that is by using @XML root element. So there, so student here, the student class is being mapped to this student root element. Okay, same thing with all the other properties, right? Notice that we have here, we have IDs and first name and last name, and we want to map them to these elements and these attributes. So we want to map this ID private string over here. We want to map it to this attribute ID 123, and whereas we want to map this this first name and last name property, right? These strings, we want to map them to these elements, first name and last name. So the ID, map it to an attribute, and we're going to map the first name and last name. We're going to map them to elements. Right. So to do that, right, what we do is that we go and we'll first say that the student is the root element, and that's root student element is going to have an attribute. It's going to have an XML attribute for the ID, right? And notice that we are annotating the setters, right? Specifically, we annotate the functions, right? The methods, the setters, right? Not the elements themselves, not the properties, not the ID property or the first name property. Instead, we annotate the methods. Again, so we're mapping the ID with the XML attribute, and we're mapping the property's first name with the XML elements. And we would annotate all, the last name as well. Right? Once you've annotated that, once you've annotated your Java class, notice that other than these annotations, this Java class is just a plain old Java object, right? A POJO. Right? There's nothing special about this Java class. You can still instantiate it and work with it and use it like any other Java class. But by annotating it here, we have added the feature that we could, this Java class could be mapped to an XML document for reading and writing. So let's take a look at how we could read, right? How we can read the data back and forth between XML documents and Java class. So let's instantiate a brand new student object representing Alice in this case, and the way we are going to write or read from or to an XML document, right? We're going to use the JAXB API. So the way the JAXB works is that we create what is called a JAXB context. So the JAXB context is very similar, or it's the equivalent of the JPA repository. If you remember, right, we instantiated a JPA repository, and when we created a CRUD repository, right? And when we instantiated and declared the CRUD repository, if you remember, it took as argument, we had to configure it and tell it, what is it that you are writing or reading from the database, right? Are you reading and writing students or grades or quizzes? What are you reading and writing from the database, right? And the way we did that is we used generics. Excuse me. Oh no, I coughed into my hands. Excuse me. I'll wash my hands later. So we use generics, right, to configure that the CRUD repository was for this specific class, right? We used the class name, and we also provided the primary key. Here, the equivalent is that when we instantiate a JAXB context, we are providing the class, right, of what it is that we want to read or write into an XML document. Okay. Once we have that, right, we have operations. Some of the more common operations, right, in a JPA repository, it provides us with finders and save and deletes and whatnot. So it provided some of the CRUD operations. Here, the JAXB context only really provides two operations. One is for reading documents into memory or writing documents into XML documents. So either I'm going to read from an XML document into memory, or from memory I'm going to write it into an XML document. And those two operations are the overall name for this operation is called marshalling, right? So marshalling comes from the stream world, right? When you are converting some binary representation into a stream, right? And you're either sending it over the wire in a network, or you're reading it from a file, or reading or writing from a file. Usually those operations are referred to as marshalling, meaning convert some binary representation into a stream of ASCII or some code that is going to be read or written into a stream. To write into a stream or write into a file system, we instantiate a marshaller, right? The marshaller is going to be used for writing an XML document. So once we have the marshaller, you can create a file, and we'll call it alice.xml, and we're going to marshal, right, the XML document, the data representation, right, the object Alice, right, we're going to marshal it into an XML document also called Alice. So Alice lives in the object in memory, and we're going to represent it in the file alice.xml. And we do that by doing a marshal, meaning convert this object representation in memory, write it to a file called XML file alice.xml. Make sense? So that is writing into a file. We can do the inverse, right? We can read it from the XML into in memory. That's called unmarshaling, right? And we'll have an example of that a little later.